It was one of those mornings in Kansas that felt deceptively ordinary. The sky was a brilliant blue, scattered clouds drifting lazily across the horizon, and the golden wheat fields stretched endlessly, swaying gently in the autumn breeze. At Wichita Regional Airport, Flight 612 was preparing for departure. For most of the 142 passengers, this was just another trip, a mundane crossing from one city to another. Yet, unbeknownst to them, routine was about to shatter in the most unimaginable way. John Miller, a 42-year-old farmer from a small town outside Salina, was among the passengers. He wore a faded baseball cap and a jacket dusted with remnants of last week's harvest. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of gripping plows and steering tractors, rested on the armrests. John's eyes, sharp from early morning spent scanning open fields for crop health, scanned the cabin with mild curiosity. He had never been particularly comfortable in planes. The confined space and forced schedule always made him uneasy. But today, he told himself, it was just another leg in a trip that was supposed to be ordinary. The hum of the four Pratt & Whitney engines filled the cabin, a low, rhythmic vibration that passengers subconsciously associated with safety. Flight attendants moved efficiently along the aisles, checking belts and offering reassuring smiles. Children fidgeted in their seats, couples whispered to each other, and business travelers typed furiously on laptops. Outside, the tarmac glimmered under the morning sun as ground crew finished their final checks. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for the faint tension in the air that no one could name. As Flight 612 rolled down the runway, John's mind wandered to his farm. The harvest was nearly complete, and the coming winter promised long, quiet nights in his old farmhouse. He imagined the scent of warm bread, the crackle of the fireplace, and the weightless peace of a quiet evening. But the peace he imagined was fragile. In the cockpit, the captain, a seasoned aviator with more than 20 years of flight experience, engaged the throttles smoothly. He and his co-pilot exchanged glances, professional, calm, practiced. The plane lifted gracefully, climbing into the cerulean sky, leaving behind the tarmac and the tiny airport as if it had never existed. Passengers settled in. A soft chatter filled the cabin, punctuated by the distant hum of engines. John leaned back, trying to relax, his hands loosely gripping the armrest as the plane leveled at 30,000 feet. For a moment he almost believed it would be a normal flight, an uneventful journey across the Midwest. He closed his eyes, the vibration of the engines almost hypnotic, and for the first time in hours allowed himself a sense of calm. But then, without warning, the calm shattered. A violent jolt ran through the aircraft, rattling overhead compartments and sending drinks skimming across trays. Passengers gasped, some shrieking as the plane pitched sharply. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, dangling like ghostly hands. Panic rippled through the cabin, a contagious primal fear. Flight attendants struggled to maintain composure, but their polished smiles wavered under the sudden, overwhelming tension. John's heart pounded. His farmer instincts kicked in, the kind honed over decades of facing storms, machinery malfunctions, and dangerous situations he never anticipated. He gripped the armrests, eyes wide, scanning the cabin. The screams of terrified passengers mixed with the wailing alarms that echoed from the cockpit. Outside the windows, the endless Kansas landscape seemed to tilt and blur, the wheat fields twisting like water under the speed of the aircraft's sudden instability. From the cockpit, the captain's voice was audible over the intercom, tight and strained. "Mayday, engine failure, all four engines, mayday." The words froze the blood in John's veins. All four engines. The phrase was almost incomprehensible. Planes weren't supposed to fail like that. Yet the vibration, the shuddering, and the unnatural silence of the propellers confirmed the worst. His stomach turned, and a cold dread filled the cabin like a fog. Passengers clutched whatever they could, hands, seatbacks, friends, even strangers. A mother held her child, whispering words she barely believed herself. John felt a strange, icy clarity wash over him amid the terror. He was just a farmer. He was not a trained pilot. Yet his mind, quick and methodical from years of running a farm, started mapping out possibilities. He recalled every lesson of resilience, every moment where calm had been the difference between survival and disaster. And in that split second, a dangerous thought emerged. Maybe, just maybe, he could help. The plane lurched again, violently, as if testing the sanity of everyone aboard. A section of the cabin lights flickered. Passengers screamed in unison as trays and personal items were tossed into the air. John's hands tightened around the armrests, knuckles white. He could feel the aircraft tilting, swaying as though caught in an invisible current. The horizon outside no longer looked familiar. There were no roads, no towns, just an endless sea of gold and green, rushing up to meet them in terrifying proximity. Above in the distant sky, the radar screens in Wichita's control tower blinked frantically. Controllers scrambled, issuing urgent warnings, tracking the descending plane with disbelief. Military intercepts were ordered. F-22 fighter jets roared to life, streaking across the plains like silver streaks of lightning, their pilots alert and tense. They had never encountered a situation like this in real life. An airliner with all engines failing, descending rapidly over civilian territory. Every trained mind in the room recognized the unthinkable. Survival depended on luck, skill, and perhaps something else entirely. Back in the cabin, John's eyes shifted from the shaking plane to the emergency checklists he could just make out in the cockpit. Pilots were shouting to each other, the intercom breaking under static and panic. John had never touched a yoke in his life, but his instincts screamed, observe, calculate, act. The thought was reckless, almost insane, but time was vanishing faster than the horizon below. Every second the ground rushed up closer like a predator closing in. A passenger near him screamed, gripping his shoulder. John nodded, trying to convey calm he didn't feel. "Stay still, stay calm," he muttered, mostly to himself. Somewhere deep in his mind he visualized his fields back home, the straight rows of wheat he had spent months tending. Line them up. Steady hands, steady hands. If he could just guide, just somehow, perhaps they could survive the impossible. The plane shuddered again. The co-pilot's voice cut through the intercom, panicked. We're not going to make it, brace for impact." The words landed like a sledgehammer. Every passenger froze. John's stomach lurched violently. Somewhere far above, the F-22s hovered, engines screaming in silent tension, their pilots stunned by the unfolding real-life horror. John's gaze shifted to the instruments, the yoke, the throttles. He didn't know if he could do it. He didn't even know how he could. But the farmer in him, the man who had faced storms, fires, and machines that threatened to tear his world apart, took a breath and made a silent, unspoken vow. If the plane was going down, he wouldn't go down without trying. And in that moment, as the engines failed completely, the world outside became a blur of gold and blue, and John Miller prepared to do the unthinkable. Take control of Flight 612. The cabin of Flight 612 had descended into chaos. Passengers clutched each other, tears streaking their faces, as the plane lurched violently from side to side. A mother held her young daughter close, whispering frantic reassurances, but even her own voice quivered with fear. Drinks flew through the air, colliding with windows and tray tables, shattering into glass and plastic shards. The acrid scent of burning circuits mingled with the metallic tang of adrenaline and panic. Every jolt of the plane made hearts skip a beat, every alarm a death knell. John Miller's knuckles were white around the armrest, yet his mind was sharper than ever. He had grown up on the farm, battling nature's fury. Tornadoes that tore through wheat fields, equipment failures that could ruin an entire season, and livestock emergencies that demanded split-second decisions. Yet nothing had prepared him for this. A jetliner at 30,000 feet, completely powerless, hurtling toward the earth like a wounded bird. Still, instinct kicked in. He had to act. The co-pilot tried to stabilize the plane, his face pale, sweat streaming down his temples. "We're losing altitude too fast," he shouted, his voice breaking under strain. The captain barked orders that barely reached clarity over the blaring alarms. In the cabin, people were screaming, some sobbing uncontrollably, others frozen in disbelief. It was a perfect storm of fear, and John felt the raw weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He wasn't supposed to do anything. He wasn't trained. And yet he couldn't just sit and watch. Looking toward the cockpit, John's eyes locked onto the yoke and the panels of instruments he barely recognized. Switches, dials, and levers seemed to blink in mockery, an unintelligible language that would have daunted anyone else. But years of reading machinery, diagnosing problems on tractors and combines, and improvising in the middle of storms had taught him one thing: machines obey patterns. Machines respond to focus. And right now, the lives of 141 strangers depended on understanding the patterns of a machine he had never flown. The plane tilted suddenly, sending a wave of nausea through the cabin. Screams cut through the air as the fuselage shuddered violently. A young man in the first row pressed his face into the seat in front of him, trembling uncontrollably. A grandmother prayed aloud, clutching rosary beads as if their mere presence could tether them to safety. John inhaled sharply, letting the scent of his own sweat mix with the recycled air. He could feel every bump, every shudder, every subtle change in the plane's behavior. His mind raced, visualizing what it would take to regain control. Meanwhile, the F-22s streaked overhead, their pilots' eyes fixed on the descending aircraft. They were trained for aerial combat, for intercepts, for engaging targets, but never for this. A civilian airliner with no engines, no power, and hundreds of lives on the line. Silence fell in the fighter jets, a heavy tension between skill and disbelief. Every maneuver, every calculation felt futile. Below them, a man who had never flown a plane was about to confront the impossible. Back in the cabin, a flight attendant struggled to maintain calm. "Everyone, please stay seated. Stay seated," she shouted, though her voice trembled with the same fear she tried to suppress. Panic had a rhythm, a contagious energy, and it was spreading faster than the plane's descent. Passengers clung to their seats, arms intertwined, faces pale. Some whispered farewells, others screamed in defiance, refusing to accept the imminent disaster. John's gaze shifted to the emergency checklist lying on the co-pilot's side. It was a jumble of symbols and instructions that seemed almost alien. Yet in that moment something clicked. He didn't need to know everything, he just needed to act methodically, step by step, one problem at a time. His first thought: stabilize the plane. The second: find a way to control the descent. The third: guide it to land. And the fourth, most urgent thought: survive. The captain's voice cut through the chaos again, hoarse and desperate. "We can't hold it, prepare for impact." The words were like a hammer to the chest. Passengers screamed, some banging their fists against seats, others burying their faces in their hands. The plane lurched again, tilting hard to one side, and John felt the full force of gravity push him into his seat. For a heartbeat, time slowed. He saw every detail: the overhead compartments trembling, a bottle of water frozen midair, the wide eyes of a child staring directly at him. Then a thought, wild and reckless, surged forward. "I have to try. I have to take control." John pushed himself out of his seat, steadying against the armrests. His eyes darted to the cockpit door. It was partially open. The captain slumped over the controls, clearly exhausted, the co-pilot barely conscious. A passenger shrieked behind him, and John's body reacted on pure adrenaline. He lunged forward, gripping the yoke with trembling hands, trying to decipher the chaotic symphony of dials and buttons in front of him. The plane tilted again, almost throwing him across the cockpit floor. Yet through the blur of panic, he remembered one thing: machines follow input. Control, even minimal, can influence outcome. Above, the F-22s adjusted formation, circling in tight patterns. Their engines screamed in furious protest, yet none dared intervene directly. Military training had no manual for this scenario, an untrained civilian guiding a stricken airliner. Their silence was tense, almost reverent, as they watched the impossible unfold. One pilot murmured under his breath, "He's actually doing it." In the cabin, chaos reached a new peak. A man screamed for his wife, a woman prayed for a miracle, and children whimpered into the shoulders of strangers. Yet amid the terror, a strange pattern began to emerge. John's actions, tentative at first, began to have a subtle effect. The plane wobbled less violently, a small victory that bolstered his confidence. He adjusted the throttles as best he could, manipulated the yoke, and focused entirely on reading the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior. Each minor adjustment bought them seconds, seconds that might mean life. Then the plane shuddered violently and a loud alarm echoed through the cabin. Smoke had begun to seep from one of the engines. Fear spiked instantly. Passengers screamed, eyes wide in disbelief. John froze for a heartbeat, then forced himself to breathe, forcing rational thought over panic. Smoke or no smoke, he reminded himself this plane was still in motion. There was still a chance. There had to be. The thought was interrupted by a sudden jolt that threw the plane off balance, sending trays, personal belongings, and a stream of panic cascading through the aisles. Flight attendants struggled to help passengers secure themselves. A grandmother screamed, gripping the arms of her chair, "We're going to die. We're all going to die." John met her eyes and without words tried to convey the only thing that mattered: hold on. His hands shook as he worked the controls, each movement deliberate, precise, yet guided entirely by instinct. He wasn't a pilot, he was a farmer. But for the first time in his life, those years of hardship, skill, and focus became a weapon against the unthinkable. Outside, the fields below rose and fell like waves on a golden sea. Above, the F-22s followed silently, engines roaring, waiting, watching. Every passing second was a lifetime, every movement a gamble. And then, in the cacophony of alarms, screams, and engine sputters, John made a decision. He would take the plane down himself. He would land it, somehow, anywhere, even if it was the only chance left for all of them. The cabin fell into a tense, fragile silence as he moved toward the yoke, heart hammering in his chest. Passengers turned, eyes filled with terror and hope intertwined. The plane shuddered one final time, and John Miller realized that in just a few seconds, every action he took could be the difference between life and death. The cockpit smelled of fear and ozone, a sharp, acrid reminder of what was happening outside. John Miller's hands gripped the yoke with trembling determination. He had never flown a plane before, not even a small crop duster, and yet here he was, 30,000 feet above Kansas, with a powerless airliner and more than 100 lives depending on him. The instruments blinked and buzzed like a foreign language, yet instinct, honed over decades on his farm, urged him to act methodically. He needed to stabilize the plane first, even if that meant defying everything he'd been taught about fear. The co-pilot groaned from the side of the cockpit, sweat glistening on his forehead. His face was ashen, his body trembling. You can't, he stammered, but John didn't have time for doubt. Every second mattered. He scanned the panels, tracing the needles, dials, and switches as if reading a map. He recalled a tractor's engine back home that had failed mid-harvest, a machine that refused to obey any manual. If he could coax that engine back to life, perhaps he could coax life into this plane. The plane shuddered violently. A jolt ran through the fuselage, rattling the overhead bins and sending passengers screaming. John gritted his teeth, focusing entirely on the controls. He adjusted the yoke slightly, testing the plane's response. The aircraft tilted dangerously, but the wobble lessened. It was not much, but it was progress. The first glimmer of hope. The F-22s streaked overhead, engines roaring, their pilots exchanging incredulous glances. They had trained for years, but no protocol existed for this. An untrained civilian taking control of a failing airliner in real time. From the cabin, the sound of terror was deafening. Children clutched stuffed animals, parents held them tightly, and a few passengers had gone silent, staring blankly into the distance. Flight attendants moved frantically, helping some, attempting to calm others, but the panic was a storm that refused to be tamed. John ignored it all. His world had narrowed to the cockpit, the instruments, the yoke, and the one impossible task: keep the plane in the air. He reached for a throttle, unsure if he was doing the right thing. The plane responded ever so slightly. A small victory, almost imperceptible, but it sent adrenaline surging through his veins. He muttered under his breath as if chanting a mantra, Steady, steady, steady. He visualized his wheat fields, the long straight lines he had plowed countless times. That rhythm, that precision became his anchor. Line it up. Keep it straight. Stay calm. Outside, the world was a blur. Clouds streaked past at dizzying speed, and the sprawling Kansas fields rushed to meet them. The F-22s flanked the plane, keeping a close eye but staying just out of reach. The pilots were silent, tension etched into every line of their faces. They had seen military jets lose control, airliners falter, but never a civilian step into the cockpit and begin to assert command over life and death with nothing but raw instinct. A sudden, violent dip threw John forward, knocking his knee into the instrument panel. Sparks flew from one of the control circuits. The plane groaned like a wounded animal. Panic flared in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe. He remembered every farm disaster, the times a storm threatened to destroy everything, the tractors that refused to start, the animals trapped in dangerous situations. In each case, he had found a solution, some way to survive, some way to regain control. This was no different, except the stakes were higher. From the co-pilot's seat, a weak voice whispered, trembling, You're actually doing it." John didn't respond. Words were a luxury. Every nerve in his body was alert, every muscle tensed, every thought consumed with the rhythm of the aircraft. He adjusted the yoke again, small movements, incremental corrections. The plane leveled barely. Another minor victory, yet monumental. He allowed himself a fraction of pride, just enough to keep moving forward. Then an urgent voice cut through the static from air traffic control. "Flight 612, we have military intercepts overhead. F-22s are visual. Do you copy?" John's mind raced. He wasn't trained in radio communication, but he could see the blinking lights on the panel, the buttons that could transmit. He pressed one, and his voice, surprisingly steady despite the chaos, came through. "This is John Miller. I'm trying to stabilize the plane. Request guidance." The silence on the other end was terrifying. Then came a calm, measured voice. "Mr. Miller, remain calm. You're doing well. Focus on keeping the plane level. The F-22s will escort you. You're in uncharted territory, but keep going." John exhaled, realizing that the world itself was now holding its breath. Outside, the F-22s hovered, engines screaming, their presence both reassuring and terrifying. He could feel their gaze as if they were silently judging every move, expecting him to fail. Yet with every jolt, every shudder, every tiny adjustment, he began to feel a strange connection to the aircraft, as if the metal, hydraulics, and instruments were responding to his will. The plane dipped again, more violently this time. A cry went up from the cabin, a mixture of terror and despair. John's hands tightened on the yoke. He had to prevent a stall, had to maintain control. Slowly, carefully, he nudged the flaps, feeling the plane respond. A small wave of hope surged through him. It's still alive. We're still alive. But the miracle was fragile. Smoke began curling from one of the failing engines, and a metallic smell filled the cockpit. Sparks flickered along a panel. John's stomach dropped. One wrong move, one tiny error could send the plane into a fatal dive. Yet panic was a luxury he could not afford. Focus, precision, calm, those were his only weapons now. Passengers continued to scream. A woman in the back row cried out for her husband, who had his head buried in his hands. A child's toy rolled down the aisle, clattering against seats. Flight attendants clutched seatbacks, trying to enforce order, but the cabin had transformed into a hurricane of fear. And in the eye of that hurricane, John Miller, the unlikeliest pilot in history, worked tirelessly, guided by instinct, logic, and sheer willpower. Time became elastic. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into eternities. John's muscles ached, his mind burned with concentration, but he refused to yield. The plane's descent had slowed, a testament to his nascent control. The F-22s matched every maneuver, hovering like guardians, silent witnesses to the impossible. Air traffic control monitored every flicker on the radar, holding their collective breath, issuing instructions, yet knowing that at this altitude, only one factor truly mattered: John Miller's hands on the yoke. Then came a new threat, a sudden jolt from the remaining engines sputtering unpredictably. The plane tilted, almost rolling sideways. Passengers screamed anew. The metal groaned in protest. John's heart raced. This was no longer about learning or practice, it was survival. He adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttles, and prayed that his instincts, honed from plowing fields and surviving storms, were enough. A voice broke through the cockpit radio again, calm yet urgent. "Flight 612, do not lose focus. You're doing the impossible. Just maintain control. You will have a chance to land. Just don't panic." John's gaze swept over the instrument panel. The plane was still responding, barely, but responding. Hope flared within him, tempered by the knowledge that one wrong adjustment could end everything. Sweat streamed down his face, his muscles trembled, yet he refused to break. He would not fail. Not today. Not on his watch. The world outside became a blur of blue sky and golden farmland. Below, the endless wheat fields stretched like a tapestry, oblivious to the struggle unfolding above. The F-22s hovered silently, their pilots holding formation, witnessing the impossible. A farmer, untrained, struggling with life and death, refusing to give in to chaos. And then, amid the cacophony of alarms, the screams of terrified passengers and the sputtering engines, John made a decision. He would take full control. He would try to land this plane himself. The cockpit was a storm of blinking lights, warning alarms, and the faint smell of smoke. John Miller's hands gripped the yoke as if it were a lifeline, because it was. The plane still shuddered violently, pitching slightly to the left, then jerking right in reaction to the unresponsive engines. Every fiber of John's body was engaged. Sweat poured down his face, soaking the collar of his shirt. The passengers behind him screamed, some crying, some frozen in disbelief, but John had no choice but to focus. He had to take control. There was no one else who could. The co-pilot sat slumped, almost unconscious from exhaustion and panic. I don't know if you can hold it," he muttered, voice weak, trembling. John ignored him. Words were useless. Action was the only language that mattered now. He scanned the array of instruments with a precision he didn't know he possessed. Each dial, lever, and switch became part of a single system. The machine and the man must act as one, or all would die. John's mind raced as he recalled his life on the farm. The tractor that refused to start. The harvester that jammed in the middle of a thunderstorm. The livestock trapped in mud. In each case, he had relied on intuition, patience, and a willingness to act when no one else could. He realized the parallels were uncanny. He was improvising, reading the machine's behavior, responding instinctively to feedback. Only now, the stakes were infinitely higher. Outside the windows, the sky stretched like an endless ocean, golden plains rushing to meet them below. The plane's descent had slowed marginally, but it was still too fast. John adjusted the flaps carefully, nudging them to create drag. The plane wobbled, threatening to spiral, but he countered instinctively with minute movements of the yoke. It was like walking a tightrope. One misstep, one false twitch, and everything could collapse. The F-22s flanking the plane had adjusted their formation, engines roaring, yet maintaining a respectful distance. Their pilots were awestruck, exchanging terse, incredulous words over their comms. One veteran whispered, "He's actually stabilizing it." History was unfolding above Kansas wheat fields, and the world below would soon learn that an ordinary farmer was performing the impossible. Inside the cabin, panic was reaching a crescendo. Passengers screamed, some shouted prayers, others prayed silently, gripping the hands of strangers. Flight attendants worked furiously to keep the chaos manageable, but the turbulence and the failed engines made the cabin a maelstrom. Yet amidst the fear, something remarkable began to happen. The passengers noticed subtle changes. The violent jerks were less pronounced. The constant lurching eased slightly. Hope, fragile but present, flickered in their eyes. John leaned over the throttle quadrant, fumbling with levers, pressing buttons he barely understood. He had no formal knowledge of emergency procedures, no training in aviation, only instinct and observation. Slowly, ever so slowly, the plane's descent began to stabilize. The horizon outside straightened. The wheat fields below grew larger, more defined. He began to imagine a potential landing site, scanning for the longest, flattest strip, a field, a rural airstrip, or even a long stretch of road. The co-pilot attempted to speak again, his voice barely audible over the alarms. You might actually. But John silenced him with a glance. There was no room for words now. Communication existed in the language of motion, the tilt of the plane, the pressure on the yoke, the subtle tug of the flaps. Every correction mattered. One wrong move and all hope would vanish. John thought of the F-22s hovering above. Their presence was both reassuring and terrifying. Trained pilots, combat veterans, silent witnesses to a civilian taking command of a stricken jetliner. Their engines screamed, a deafening roar that pressed against his chest, but they did not intervene. This was not their fight, it was his. The responsibility was crushing, but it was also liberating in its clarity. He alone could save these lives. The plane jolted again, throwing John's arms against the yoke. Sparks flickered from a panel as one engine coughed weakly. Fear clawed at him, but he pushed it down, focusing entirely on the instruments. He remembered a lesson from the farm. When machinery fails, panic is the enemy. Observation, patience, and steady hands are the solution. He applied it here with every ounce of willpower. The plane responded ever so slightly, a delicate dance of control and survival. Minutes felt like hours. John's vision narrowed, the cabin sounds fading into a dull roar, leaving only the thrum of the aircraft, the alarms, and the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Outside, the landscape approached rapidly, golden wheat fields interspersed with roads, barns, and farmhouses. He scanned desperately for the flattest possible stretch. There was no perfect runway. There was only the earth, and whatever chance he could create. A sudden violent lurch sent a wave of nausea through the cockpit. John pressed himself against the yoke, countering instinctively. Sparks flew again from the instrument panel. The co-pilot groaned, sliding down to the floor in fear. John ignored him, focusing on what mattered, survival. He could feel the plane obeying, if only marginally, to his small, precise adjustments. The impossible was beginning to feel just within reach. Then came the call from air traffic control, crackling over the radio. Flight 612, we see your attempts. You are astonishing. Do you copy? John, voice tight with strain, replied, yes. I'm trying, I have to land it. His words sounded almost foreign in the tense cockpit, but they were true. And outside, the F-22s shifted formation, keeping the plane in sight while allowing him control. The passengers began to sense the change. The violent dips lessened. The jerks of the plane's descent became slightly more predictable. A hush began to fall over the cabin, not of relief, but of tense, fragile hope. John allowed himself a mental breath, focusing entirely on the landscape below. He needed to pick a landing site, fast. The plane's momentum was unforgiving. Every second counted. He spotted it, a long, flat strip of land, flanked by wheat fields and a few farm buildings. It was narrow, imperfect, but it was the best chance he had. He had to aim for it. Every movement mattered. One wrong angle, one misjudged flap, and it would be catastrophic. John adjusted the yoke, aligning the plane with the target, and guided the throttle as best he could, feeling the aircraft respond to his touch. The plane shuddered violently again, dipping dangerously low over a cluster of trees. Passengers screamed, gripping each other in desperation. Flight attendants held on, trying to maintain order, shouting instructions that barely pierced the roar of engines, alarms, and fear. John's hands were white on the yoke, muscles screaming with fatigue, but he pressed on. There was no other option. As the plane leveled over the field, sparks from the panel danced like fireflies, a warning of impending failure. Smoke curled from the engine cowling. Yet John remained focused, every ounce of concentration applied to keeping the aircraft steady, aligned, and alive. The horizon tilted, and he could see the F-22s hovering silently above, watching history unfold. Could he truly guide this plane safely to the ground? Could a farmer with no training accomplish what professional pilots had feared for decades? The plane hovered above the Kansas landscape, its descent slowing only slightly despite John Miller's desperate, precise adjustments. Outside, the F-22s flanked the powerless airliner, engines screaming in protest, yet maintaining their formation with uncanny precision. Their pilots had never encountered a civilian handling a stricken airliner in real time. Every move John made was measured, deliberate, and terrifying in its audacity. In their years of combat training, they had learned to expect the impossible, but nothing like this. Inside Flight 612, panic still raged. Passengers clung to seats, arms intertwined, some whispering frantic prayers, others screaming into the chaos. A young boy pressed his face into his mother's chest, trembling uncontrollably, while a grandmother held her rosary beads with white-knuckled intensity. Flight attendants moved tirelessly, trying to restore some semblance of order, but the cabin had become a storm of fear, screams, and adrenaline. Yet amidst the chaos, a fragile hope began to flicker. The violent dips were slightly less erratic. The plane's wobbling had steadied marginally. Somehow, against all odds, it was still responding. John's focus had narrowed into a tunnel vision. He was no longer thinking about passengers, alarms, or fear, only the instruments and the horizon ahead. He leaned forward, scanning for any patch of land large enough to attempt a landing. Fields stretched in every direction, but every option was narrow, uneven, or dotted with obstacles. Power lines, barns, and farm equipment threatened to turn the plane into a tomb. He adjusted the flaps slightly, nudged the throttle, and whispered to himself, "Steady. Steady, steady." His voice was almost lost amidst the roar of failing engines and screaming passengers, but it was a lifeline for his own sanity. Above, the F-22s mirrored his movements, a silent escort. They didn't interfere. Interference could destabilize the plane and doom everyone. Instead, they provided a kind of protective pressure, blocking potential obstacles and keeping the world at bay while John fought for control. One pilot radioed nervously to the others, "We're witnessing history, he's actually flying it." The acknowledgement was almost irrelevant. Outside, the world was holding its breath, just as the passengers inside were clinging to life by a thread. John finally spotted the landing site, a long, narrow farm strip flanked by fields, barns, and scattered trees. Imperfect, dangerous, the kind of landing only a miracle could make possible, but he had no choice. He adjusted the plane's alignment, eyes locked on the distant strip. Every movement of the yoke was calculated, every throttle adjustment measured in fractions of seconds. The plane groaned as it tilted, groaning like a living creature resisting the inevitable descent. The cabin erupted in screams again as the plane dipped sharply over a cluster of trees. Children cried, adults yelled, and flight attendants shouted, trying to maintain order in the chaos. Yet amidst the terror, some began to notice a subtle change. The violent lurching had eased slightly. The plane was responding. Somehow, the untrained hands of a Kansas farmer were coaxing life into a vessel designed for professionals. The realization was almost impossible, yet undeniably true. A burst of smoke from one engine curled ominously into the cabin. Sparks flickered from a nearby panel. The co-pilot slumped further, murmuring incoherently, "I don't know how." John didn't answer. Words were useless. He had to focus entirely on the task at hand. The plane's descent had slowed further, and he adjusted the flaps once more, gently nudging the yoke to keep the wings level. One wrong move, one sudden jerk, could send them plummeting. The field below drew closer. Barns and silos raced toward the fuselage. Power lines stretched like deadly webs across the horizon. John's mind raced through every calculation he could make: angle of descent, airspeed, wind currents, potential obstacles. He envisioned the plane gliding like a massive bird, coaxed by the rhythm of his movements, controlled entirely by intuition honed on a farm. Each adjustment brought the plane closer to the strip, closer to survival. The passengers sensed the change. The fear in the cabin was still palpable, but it was tempered by awe. The violent dips had lessened. The plane's movement was deliberate, purposeful. A mother whispered to her child, maybe we'll be okay." A man across the aisle clutched his wife's hand tightly, eyes wide with disbelief. Some of the crew began to give quiet instructions, realizing that survival was now a tangible possibility. The F-22 pilots overhead held formation, their presence both protective and intimidating. One of them spoke quietly into the radio, voice taut with disbelief. He's lining it up, he's actually lining it up. Their training had prepared them for every emergency imaginable, yet this scenario, an untrained civilian attempting a landing with a dead aircraft, was unprecedented. And yet there he was, maneuvering with a skill that seemed impossible. John's gaze was fixed on the narrow strip of land. He adjusted the plane's angle, lowering the nose slightly to maintain a controlled descent. The landing gear was partially deployed, clattering and groaning but holding. Sparks flickered from the panels as the plane responded to his movements. The horizon tilted slightly, the wind gusted unpredictably, and the strip below seemed impossibly narrow, but John remained calm in the only way he could: absolute focus, step by step, breath by breath. Suddenly, a flock of birds appeared ahead, startled by the descending aircraft. John's reflexes kicked in. He adjusted the yoke, nudged the flaps, and the plane tilted just enough to avoid them. The cabin erupted with screams and prayers, passengers clutching each other in fear. Outside, the F-22s adjusted their formation, flanking the plane as it approached the landing strip. History was being written with each trembling second. John's hands ached, muscles trembling, but he pressed on. He had to align perfectly. Any miscalculation could mean catastrophe. The plane groaned again as it dipped, but it responded to his adjustments. The strip below grew larger, more defined. The wheat fields on either side blurred as the aircraft moved with painstaking precision. Passengers whispered, prayed, screamed all at once. The plane was alive, but just barely. He focused entirely on the landing strip, calculating, visualizing, and trusting his instincts. The plane wobbled slightly, but John adjusted quickly. Every second felt like an eternity, every movement critical. Sparks danced along the instrument panel. Smoke curled from the engine cowling, yet he persisted. The impossible was no longer abstract. It was tangible, alive, and within reach. And then, just as the plane neared the strip, a gust of wind caught the fuselage, tilting it dangerously. The plane rocked violently and passengers screamed anew. John's heart hammered. Sweat stung his eyes. He clenched the yoke tighter, fighting every instinct to panic. He whispered to himself, "Steady, steady, steady." The plane stabilized miraculously, just as the landing strip loomed directly below. John had aligned it perfectly, or as perfectly as a farmer with no training could manage. The F-22s hovered overhead, engines screaming, their pilots frozen in awe. Below, the ground approached faster than any human could process, but the plane was responding. The landing strip stretched ahead, a narrow ribbon of possibility amidst the endless Kansas farmland. John Miller's heart pounded in rhythm with the violent vibrations of Flight 612. Sparks flickered from the control panels, smoke curled from a failing engine, and the plane groaned under its own weight. The passengers screamed and clutched each other as if sheer will could tether them to survival. Time had slowed to a crawl. Every second, every movement, every breath mattered. One misstep could be fatal. Yet, amid the chaos, John felt a strange calm. He was in control, if only barely. The plane dipped slightly, and he corrected immediately. His hands, trembling but firm, guided the massive aircraft toward the narrow strip of land. The wheat fields and barns blurred below, the earth rising up to meet them in a surreal dance. The F-22s remained overhead, engines screaming, creating a protective aerial corridor, their pilots frozen in awe at the farmer's daring maneuver. No one could believe what they were witnessing. A man with no training, navigating a crippled jetliner, threading the eye of an impossible needle. John leaned over the yoke, his eyes scanning every inch of the strip. Barns loomed dangerously close. Power lines stretched across the approach path like invisible death traps. He adjusted the throttle, nudged the flaps, and allowed the plane to glide as gently as possible, feeling every vibration through the controls. The aircraft shuddered violently, threatening to roll, but he countered instinctively. A rhythm formed from years of farming: anticipate, respond, survive. Inside the cabin, the panic had reached a fever pitch. Children whimpered, adults sobbed, and flight attendants struggled to keep people in their seats. A man across the aisle shouted prayers, clinging to his wife as if sheer force could defy gravity. The hum of fear mixed with the creaking of the plane, creating a soundscape of impending disaster. Yet a subtle shift occurred. The violent shakes had lessened slightly. The plane, fragile and battered, responded to John's desperate guidance. Hope flickered like a fragile candle against the storm. John's vision narrowed to the strip ahead. He could see the uneven edges, the potential obstacles, the danger in every inch. The landing gear rattled as he adjusted it again, praying it would hold. Sparks flew from the failing engine and the smell of smoke thickened in the cockpit. Panic clawed at him, but he forced it down. Calm, precise movements, no hesitation, no fear. He had come too far to fail now. The plane dipped lower. Wheat brushed against the landing gear, sending a spray of dust into the air. A collective scream rose from the passengers as they realized how close the ground was. John countered instinctively, lifting the nose slightly while maintaining alignment. The plane groaned but obeyed. The F-22s hovered above, witnessing the impossible unfold. One pilot whispered in disbelief, "He's actually going to make it." A sudden gust of wind caught the fuselage, tilting the plane dangerously to one side. John's hands shook violently on the yoke, but he corrected immediately. The aircraft leveled, hovering just above the strip. The landing gear rattled against uneven terrain, groaning under the stress. The passengers clutched each other tighter, some closing their eyes, others screaming with terror. The plane's descent had slowed, but the final moments were still the most dangerous. Every movement, every adjustment was critical. John's mind raced. He calculated every inch, every angle, every possible outcome. The strip was uneven, the surrounding fields dotted with obstacles, and the engine sputtered unpredictably. Yet he remained focused, trusting instinct over fear. His years on the farm, navigating machinery, facing storms, saving livestock, had prepared him in ways he never realized. He was improvising, adapting, surviving. The plane dipped again, dangerously low, and sparks flickered from the panels. Smoke thickened in the cockpit. Passengers screamed in unison, the sound a mixture of terror and desperate hope. John's muscles ached, his hands trembling, yet he maintained a steady rhythm. The aircraft responded inch by inch to his control. The impossible was no longer abstract, it was happening. He glanced at the F-22s above. The pilots' faces were tense, eyes wide with disbelief. They had trained for decades, but no scenario had prepared them for this. A civilian landing a crippled airliner, threading a narrow strip of farmland against impossible odds. The silence of the F-22s was deafening, a testament to the gravity of what was unfolding. The passengers sensed the shift. The plane's violent lurching had lessened further. Hope, fragile and tentative, flickered in their eyes. They whispered prayers, held hands, and clung to each other, realizing that survival was now a tangible possibility. Yet fear remained, a constant companion. The landing was far from over, and the strip below was unforgiving. John focused entirely on the approach. The strip stretched ahead, narrow and uneven, flanked by wheat fields, barns, and power lines. He calculated every adjustment: throttle, yoke, flaps. Sparks flickered from the control panel and smoke curled from a failing engine, but the plane responded. Inch by inch, it descended toward the strip. The final moments were approaching, and every second mattered. A flock of birds suddenly appeared, startled by the low-flying plane. John's reflexes kicked in. He adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and tilted the plane just enough to avoid them. The passengers screamed, clutching each other, while flight attendants shouted instructions to brace. The F-22s hovered above, engines roaring, forming a protective corridor around the stricken aircraft. The plane descended further, the landing gear rattling violently against uneven terrain. Dust and debris sprayed from the field, brushing the fuselage. John's hands ached, his muscles trembling, but he pressed on. Every adjustment was critical, every movement deliberate. The plane's nose dipped slightly, then leveled, then dipped again. Inch by inch, the impossible was becoming reality. Finally, the plane touched down. The landing gear groaned under the weight, bouncing over uneven ground. Sparks flew, smoke thickened, and the fuselage shuddered violently. Passengers screamed, some crying, others clutching each other in disbelief. The plane skidded across the strip, narrowly avoiding power lines and farm equipment. John maintained control, adjusting the yoke with trembling precision until the aircraft finally slowed. The wheat fields stretched around them, golden and serene, a stark contrast to the chaos of the descent. The F-22s hovered silently overhead, engines roaring, witnessing history. John Miller's hands were white on the yoke, muscles trembling, yet he had done it. Against all odds, the impossible had been achieved. End of Part 6, Suspense Hook. The plane skidded to a halt, smoke curling from the engines, sparks flickering from the panels. Passengers clung to each other, sobbing, shaking in disbelief. Outside, the F-22s hovered silently, engines screaming, watching the impossible unfold. John Miller, a Kansas farmer with no flight experience, had brought a powerless airliner to the ground. But would anyone truly survive the next terrifying moments as emergency crews raced to the scene? I can now continue with Part 7 fully expanded to 1,200 words, where the aftermath unfolds. Emergency crews arrive. Passengers face the immediate danger, and John must manage the final, heart-stopping moments of survival. Do you want me to continue Part 7 next? You said. Continue Part 7, 1,200 words. ChatGPT said. Absolutely. Here's Part 7 fully expanded to 1,200 words, keeping the cinematic intensity, suspense, and emotional tension alive. Part 7, the final seconds expanded. The tires of Flight 612 screeched and groaned against the uneven field as dust, dirt, and debris rose in clouds around the landing strip. Sparks still danced along the fuselage panels, and smoke curled from the failing engine, staining the sky with acrid black streaks. John Miller's hands were white on the yoke, muscles trembling from the sheer intensity of the maneuver. His chest burned with every heartbeat. The plane had landed, but the danger was far from over. Inside, the passengers remained tense, gripping each other with wide eyes and tear-streaked faces. Every nerve in their bodies was still coiled. Some whispered prayers, others sobbed quietly, and a few sat frozen in disbelief, staring at the windows at the wheat fields rushing by. Flight attendants moved quickly, urging people to stay calm and prepare for evacuation, but their voices barely rose above the roar of engines and the hiss of settling brakes. John's gaze swept the field ahead. The narrow strip had been a miracle to hit, but the uneven ground, scattered farm equipment, and nearby barns posed a final threat. The plane's momentum was still carrying it forward. He adjusted the yoke, countered a sudden tilt, and nudged the throttles, coaxing the aircraft to slow without losing control. Sparks flew again from the panels, smoke thickened in the cockpit, and he felt the planes trembling as if it were alive, fighting against gravity, friction, and fate. Outside, emergency crews were already mobilizing. Fire trucks roared across the distant roads, lights flashing against the smoke-streaked sky. Police vehicles blocked nearby intersections, directing traffic and clearing bystanders. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the dust cloud as paramedics and firefighters prepared for the worst. Every second mattered. The plane's unstable descent had put countless lives at risk, and one wrong moment could undo everything John had fought for. The F-22s hovered silently, engines screaming in their deafening protective rhythm. The pilots exchanged glances, communicating in terse, stunned words. They had witnessed countless air emergencies in their careers, but nothing like this. A civilian controlling a stricken airliner, threading it through a narrow strip, dodging obstacles, coaxing it to survive. The awe on their faces was tempered with tension. The landing was not yet complete. John adjusted again, anticipating the final obstacle, a lone barn jutting out from the field's edge. One miscalculation and the fuselage could tear apart. He nudged the yoke carefully, lifting the plane just enough to avoid the barn while keeping the landing gear aligned with the strip. Sparks danced across the panel as the aircraft shuddered violently, but it obeyed. Inch by inch, John guided it toward safety. Inside, a young mother whispered to her child, "We're going to be okay. I think we're going to be okay." Her voice quivered with disbelief and hope. A man across the aisle clutched his wife's hand tightly, eyes wide, tears streaming down his face. Passengers had begun to realize that the impossible was happening. They were going to survive. But the tension was far from broken. One misstep could still send them all tumbling into disaster. John's breathing was steady, forced, every ounce of focus applied to controlling the massive aircraft. Sparks from the panels flickered like fireflies in the cockpit, smoke curled around his face, and his muscles ached with exhaustion. Yet he pressed on. The plane's landing gear rumbled across the uneven strip, bouncing slightly, but the aircraft held together. The horizon stabilized. The Earth, once a deadly threat, now seemed almost attainable, almost safe. Emergency crews neared the plane, sirens blaring, lights flashing. Firefighters braced their hoses, ready to douse flames if engines caught fire. Paramedics gathered stretchers, prepared for immediate triage. Police secured the perimeter. Yet even with help on the ground, the last seconds of landing remained the most perilous. The plane still had momentum. Every meter counted. John's hands ached, but he maintained a delicate balance. One tilt too far could catch the fuselage. One jolt too strong could snap the landing gear. He adjusted flaps and throttles with minute precision. Sparks flew again. Smoke thickened. The plane shuddered, but slowly, so slowly, the aircraft began to decelerate. The field, once a blur, grew closer, every detail of the terrain visible. Tire ruts, scattered debris, clumps of wheat flattened by the plane's passage. Passengers whispered, some holding hands, some murmuring prayers of thanks. The flight attendants shouted over the chaos, guiding passengers to prepare for the inevitable. The plane might stop abruptly or veer slightly. Children clutched their parents. Adults gritted their teeth. Every nerve in the cabin was taut. They were alive, but survival was still uncertain. The plane hit the soft, uneven earth of the field, tires bouncing against clumps of dirt. Sparks erupted as the landing gear struggled with the weight. The fuselage groaned. Dust billowed around the aircraft. John's muscles trembled, but he guided the plane straight. He adjusted for minor dips, nudged the flaps, and slowed the throttles. Inch by inch, meter by meter, the plane decelerated, responding to his careful guidance. The F-22s hovered above, engines roaring, watching the final moments with silent tension. The pilots' faces were taut with awe. One whispered, "He's done it, he's actually done it." Yet even they knew that until the plane fully stopped, the danger had not passed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into seconds, the plane came to a halt. Dust swirled around the landing strip. Smoke curled from the engine cowling. Sparks from the panel flickered and died. The passengers were alive. The impossible had been achieved. Cheers and sobs erupted in the cabin. Strangers embraced. Children laughed, wide-eyed with disbelief. Flight attendants wept, relief washing over their exhausted bodies. John Miller slumped against the yoke, sweat streaming down his face. His body trembled with exhaustion, his hands raw, muscles burning. He had done it. He had landed a powerless airliner in a narrow, uneven field. Against every expectation, every law of probability, he had achieved the impossible. Outside, emergency crews rushed forward. Firefighters secured the engines, dousing the smoke. Paramedics moved through the cabin, checking passengers for injuries. Police maintained order, keeping the crowd at bay. The F-22s slowly peeled away, engines roaring one final time before returning to base. The pilots exchanged stunned, reverent glances. The passengers stepped onto the uneven ground, still shaking, still crying, but alive. Children hugged parents, grandparents embraced grandchildren. Strangers hugged each other, bonded forever by a shared brush with death. The impossible had become reality. John finally climbed out of the cockpit. Emergency crews swarmed around him, congratulating him, praising him, yet he could barely hear them. His legs felt like jelly. His chest heaved. He had survived. They had survived. The world seemed impossibly bright after the shadow of death. The field was quiet now, except for the hiss of cooling engines and the distant wail of sirens approaching. Dust hung in the air, sparkling in the late afternoon sun. Flight 612 sat precariously on the narrow strip, battered but intact. Passengers emerged slowly, still trembling, clutching each other and sobbing in relief. Children ran into parents' arms, grandparents hugged grandchildren, and strangers embraced like they had known each other their entire lives. The impossible had been done. Against all odds, everyone was alive. John Miller stepped carefully from the cockpit. His body was trembling from exhaustion, sweat dripping from his forehead, and his clothes were streaked with soot and smoke. He blinked against the sunlight, finally allowing himself to take in the scene. The emergency crews had already surrounded the plane, firefighters securing engines, paramedics checking passengers, and police cordoning off the field. They stared at John, awe and disbelief etched into every face. "Sir, you're the one who landed this?" a firefighter asked, voice trembling. John nodded slowly, unable to find words. The reality of what had just occurred pressed down on him in waves. He had done the impossible. A Kansas farmer, no flight training, had safely guided a failing airliner full of terrified passengers to the ground. His life, once ordinary, had become extraordinary in a single heartbeat. The passengers began to approach him cautiously. A young mother held her child up, tears streaming down her face. "You saved us, all of us," she whispered, voice breaking. A man, shaking with disbelief, extended a hand. "I don't even know what to say, you're a hero." Words failed him. John simply nodded, offering a small, exhausted smile. There was no time to dwell on his own fear, only a quiet, profound relief that everyone had survived. News helicopters began circling overhead. Within minutes, the story exploded across every channel. Kansas farmer lands airliner, saves 164 lives. Reporters rushed to the field, cameras flashing as emergency crews guided passengers and John to safety. The narrative spread like wildfire. The man who defied death, who faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, became a national sensation before he had even fully comprehended what had happened himself. Authorities approached John, asking for statements, recounting every detail of the miraculous landing. He recounted the events calmly, almost mechanically, describing the plane's failing engines, the narrow strip, and the desperate adjustments he had made. He spoke little of fear. Instead, he focused on survival and precision. But behind his eyes, the exhaustion and adrenaline hung like a shadow. The world would see the miracle, but John felt the weight of every second, every inch, every life he had held in his hands. The passengers, meanwhile, were processed by emergency crews. Paramedics checked for injuries, some minor, some severe, but miraculously no lives had been lost. People hugged and cried, recounting moments when they thought death was imminent, when sparks flew inside the cabin, and when the plane dipped dangerously toward the ground. Children clutched parents, adults embraced strangers. The air was thick with a mixture of terror, relief, and unbridled gratitude. As the F-22s finally departed, engines screaming and leaving streaks of wind in their wake, one of the pilots broke the long silence. "We've seen everything in our careers," he said quietly to his wingman. "But this is something else. He's the unlikeliest hero I've ever witnessed." The words were almost reverent, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. The farmer, untrained and ordinary, had done what the most skilled professionals feared was impossible. News vans converged on the field. Cameras zoomed in on John's exhausted, soot-streaked face as he was asked to recount his actions. National anchors repeated the story over and over. A Kansas farmer with no flight experience lands a powerless airliner, saving 164 lives. Social media exploded with clips from eyewitnesses and helicopter footage. Comments ranged from awestruck admiration to disbelief. "How is this possible? He's a real-life superhero." Unbelievable courage. The world could not wrap its head around what had just occurred. Yet amidst the chaos of media and attention, John remained quiet, almost withdrawn. Reporters shouted questions, passengers thanked him profusely, and officials congratulated him, but he could barely respond. His body was spent, his mind reeling. He had survived the impossible, and the magnitude of what he had done had yet to fully register. Every glance at the passengers reminded him of the stakes. Every tear, every embrace was a testament to lives saved in the hands of one ordinary man. Emergency crews worked tirelessly to secure the plane and ensure no further hazards existed. Firefighters doused smoldering sparks. Paramedics moved through the cabin one last time, checking passengers for lingering injuries. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, dust, and adrenaline, but the tension that had gripped everyone moments before had lifted. The passengers were safe, the plane was stable, and John Miller had become a legend. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the golden fields, John allowed himself to breathe deeply. He had survived, yes, but he also realized something profound. Heroism could emerge from the most unexpected places. A lifetime of farming, a life of quiet routine, had prepared him in ways he could never have imagined. His courage, his instinct, and his calm under pressure had defied the impossible. Passers-by and journalists crowded the field, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. John's story would travel across the nation and the world. The farmer who landed a powerless airliner, who saved 164 lives, who defied probability and fear itself. But for John, the memory of the passengers, their faces, their tears, their gratitude, was the only recognition that mattered. Everything else was noise. The passengers slowly dispersed, some returning to their lives, some embracing loved ones who had waited anxiously. Each carried a story, a reminder of the fragility of life and the miracle of survival. Yet the legend of John Miller, the Kansas farmer who became a hero in a single, impossibly tense afternoon, would endure far beyond the wheat fields and narrow strip where the impossible had been achieved. Even as the emergency crews cleared the field and the last smoke dissipated, one image remained etched in everyone's memory. The small, unassuming figure of John Miller, standing amid chaos, dust, and smoke, exhausted but alive, a hero who had stared death in the face and refused to yield. The F-22s departed into the fading sunlight, leaving the world to wonder, how could an ordinary man accomplish something so extraordinary?